You know, one of the challenges about talking about equity incentives for a venture-backed company is that it covers a huge amount of ground, and I'm going to try to do that in an hour. And, you know, not knowing who you are, there's also a question of, you know, what level of sophistication are you at? I suspect there's some of you in the audience right now who could easily stand up here and speak with more credibility on these issues than I can. Other people who may not really understand the difference between stock and a stock option. So, you know, my mission is to try to cover a lot of this ground at kind of a reasonable level. And it's really more of a survey presentation. It's going to cover a lot of ground, and we're not going to go into depth in any one particular area. So bear with me. So I was a partner here at the law firm for many years, working with a lot of high-tech companies. And in the last couple years, I've taken on a position at Wharton as the vice dean there. My original connection with Wharton was teaching a class on startup companies and venture capital. And I've been doing that now for 6 or 7 years, and I ping-pong back and forth about this time of year between San Francisco and the Philadelphia campus. And it's been a great experience. I mean, the students in the program are just very high energy, very smart. You guys know this because you're all part of this crowd. And it's just been a wonderful experience for me. So let me jump into it and start with the fundamental premise. And this is about stock. And stock is everything. I mean, startup companies, the reason that stock is key is because, frankly, people are not in it for the cash. I mean, obviously, you need the salary and bonuses and so forth to put bread on the table. But at the end of the day, stock is the vehicle for wealth augmentation. And that's why there's so much focus and so much attention that's paid to the use of stock in the venture-backed company environment. You know, when people come in to see me and say, I want to start a company, how should I think about stock? The first question is, how are the founders going to divide up stock? And I've actually seen two schools of thought. One is, founders, if you're a founder, that means you're entitled to, you know, if you're the sole founder, you're entitled to all of it. And if you have co-founders, then there should be an even split of stock on the recognition that founders are founders are founders. There are other people who come into the equation and say, well, you know, I bring this skill set and I'm prepared to engage at this level of commitment, and this is my vision for the company. And therefore, I'm entitled to this slice of the pie. And they go out and have a beer with their co-founders and talk about how that pie is going to be divided up. And it's not an equal split. So there are definitely two different philosophies. Personally, my view is I think the even split is truer to the notion of what my concept of a founder is. A founder is somebody who has a vision and a commitment to the company and a level of dedication that dispels any doubt as to the fact that they're fully on board. And as soon as you get into a discussion, in my view, with a co-founder that says, well, I'm more important than you are, or I bring a skill set that's more valuable to the company at this juncture than yours, personally, I think you're setting yourself up for friction and irritation going forward. The companies where I've seen companies fall apart are companies where, at this stage, are companies where they do have an uneven split on the founder's stock, and as a result, it causes frustration and a sense that one founder is being overcompensated at the expense of the other. That's just my own personal anecdotal point of view. But if, for example, I'm going to pick on somebody, John Soberg sitting in the audience, I get to pick on him because he was in a class that graduated a couple years ago. So if John and I are co-founders, or we think we're co-founders, and I think actually I've got a higher sense of commitment and dedication and vision to this company than John does, that doesn't mean John doesn't get stock. I would just not label him as a founder for purposes of whatever that means. It's more of a semantic. I would nevertheless make sure that John is competitively compensated, but it's not like he's going to get 100% of the founder stock at the first juncture. So it doesn't mean people don't get stock. It just means that if you're going to attach a label, I mean, those are the people who are the drivers of the engine that's going to move forward. So how do I work this? There's some vocabulary here. I'm not going to dwell on it. I am going to pass these slides out at the end of the class, so everyone will have a copy. Actually, I have another question here for you. How many people in the audience are from the class that I was teaching? I know there are a couple people. You guys cannot talk. A lot of this is going to look familiar to you, but I am going to ask questions of you guys. I do want this to be somewhat interactive. I do use vocabulary. Founder's stock it's common stock, right? It's the same as it's stock that's being issued to a founder. Usually it has vesting associated with it. We'll get into that. But the fact that it's founder stock doesn't make it any different than any other share of common stock. It just means it's the first stock that's coming out of the company once the company gets formed. So, we get into this question of how much stock should people get at the early stages of the company? How do you figure that out? And my sense is you start at both ends. You start from the top down and then from the bottoms up in order to land on a set of some ranges that identify how much stock somebody should get in the company depending upon the position and the responsibilities that they're taking on. So, for example, there are a lot of compensation consultants out there that will provide this data to you for a cost. And if you look at a company that's kind of in the mid-stage, I mean, this is one slice at how a company should, meter out stock to its managers. Now, as we go through this, we talk about a CEO. CEO is not a founder. If you're a founder, if I'm a sole founder of the company and the CEO, I start out with 100% of the stock. And then the rest of the life of the company, it's an exercise in issuing more stock at my expense. My position in the company will be diluted. But I'm just saying there are a lot of compensation consultants out there that will provide you with information that specifies, at this level, at this juncture of the company, and for this set of responsibilities, this is the normative range that a company should use to compensate an individual. And by the way, if you're talking to professional investors, you better believe they have this information too. They will have a lot more of it than you have. But nevertheless, as you get going, you can talk with the people who are mentoring you. You can talk with experienced counsel who's been through this process before. And if you have friends who are professional investors, angels or VCs, they will have access to a lot of this information as well. So that's the top down. And here is just some of the compensation consultants. As I mentioned, these guys are expensive. And normally you don't engage them until you get pretty far down the road and you really want to fine tune and refine how you're going to be issuing stock to your employees. The bottoms up analysis should arrive at the same, Herb?
So you might want to just clarify for people those percentages, the difference between before the first VC investment comes in and afterwards. That could be significant.
Yeah, it's a fair point. I mean, this slide is tagged to a company that's in mid-stage, right? Obviously, if you're pre-funded and you're bringing in a professional CEO who's not a founder, this percentage could easily be 15 to 20%. Right? And obviously, as you get to the point where you're a mezzanine stage company and you're bringing at that point in a CEO effectively to take the company from the threshold of being private to public, then this 7% may be rich. It may be down closer to 4 or 5%. Again, it depends a lot on the investment philosophies of the company. And as Herb points out, it also depends upon the stage at which you're of the company in development. Yeah.
Just curious, founders have different kind of security that they have in terms of vesting or any other aspect of that, as opposed to just the quantity, the number of shares.
So the question is, do founders have different structures or vesting associated with their stock? Hold the thought, we'll come to it. Bottoms up analysis. So now I'm the founder of a company and I'm trying to think, okay, I've got a head count of people I want to employ. How should I think about compensating them from an equity incentive standpoint? And realistically, if you go through it, again, this is a company that has kind of already obtained its first institutional round of funding. So we come back to Herb's comment, what's the juncture that we're looking at? This is early stage, but it's funded with an institutional VC. These are, actually I hesitated about putting this slide up because it's in writing, and it's a guideline, it's a convention, it's all over the lot. But for purposes of rational discussion, I tried to craft something that I thought would be useful. So if I'm a CEO, I'm probably going to look to 5 to 10% of the organization, a non-founder CEO. And you go on down the line, you have one CFO, you have three vice presidents, you have a director level employees, maybe 6 of those people, and then you have everyone else rank and file. And if you lay out kind of what the normative guideline type ranges for equity and incentive are, you'll find, and this is, again, I actually did this once. I went through about 50 companies and did this, that it more or less adds up to about 20 to 25% of the fully diluted capital of the company. Fully diluted meaning, this is after the funding, and this is the stock that is part of the stock option reserve, which we're going to go into in a little bit. But the point is, this number is pretty much immutable, because if you take a CFO and you hire that person on board and you say, well, there's good news and bad news. The good news is you're a CFO of the company. We're delighted to have you here. The bad news is we're only going to give you 0.5% of the company. Smart people, especially in Silicon Valley, know you don't ask how many shares. They want to know what percentage of the company they're getting. And if you say, well, I'm only going to get you 0.5%, you're not going to find a decent CFO for your company. As a result, these percentages are driven by the street. This is what a self-respecting, capable employee can get as a general premise if they walk down the street and look for jobs at these positions. One other thought. So as you get going, you're going to start thinking, okay, I need to be very forward-thinking about this. I need to create a structure that I can use, that I can rationalize with my investors, and also a structure that, in my view, will provide the optimal incentives for employees. And the thought I want to plant here is that if you're hiring, an engineer in the sales group, you don't automatically start with the 10,000 share range. In effect, you should anticipate that as people come into these positions, you have to anticipate that they're going to grow. I mean, if things go swimmingly and the employee performs, you as a CEO or as a founder, as an executive, need to anticipate that people are going to grow in their positions, and you can't leave them static. This is without regard to dilution that occurs as a result of successive financings. I'm just saying, as you think about this and you construct your equity matrix that you're going to share with your board and share with your investors, think also about how you can optimize performance of each employee within the normative ranges that the industry would support. Does that make sense? Yeah, Jennifer.
How many shares is this based on?
So Jennifer's asking the question, how many shares is this based on? I have no idea. I actually pinched this from a board meeting I attended, and I don't know. So you shouldn't look upon it as being normative in the sense of the number of shares, okay? Real basic stuff. So I want to talk about, the two-class stock structure that is so common when you're looking for professional investors. So this is basic, right? I mean, we issue common stock to managers and founders and employees. Think of common stock as just an alternative form of compensation. It's like cash, except it comes in the form of stock. We're going to talk about this. It's typically priced very low. On the other side of the equation is preferred stock. It's got liquidation preferences, it's got voting rights, it's got anti-dilution protection, it has conversion rights, it has protective covenants, all these bells and whistles. All that translates into, from a tax and accounting and a governance standpoint, what that means is preferred stock is worth more than the common stock. And that's why if I'm selling preferred stock at $1 a share, I can probably use, what's called the 90% discount rule. That means I can probably sell, at least in the very early stages, my common stock at 10 cents a share. And that's why it's so important. That's why the preferred stock structure is so key. It's not just to protect the investors. It's also to provide the optimal incentive to employees who are getting common stock. So what about common stock sold to investors at preferred stock prices? What's the problem with that? What is the problem with that? I'm asking you. What's the problem? If I have a company and I've got, Acorn Capital that comes in and wants to buy my stock, and they say, let's do this really simple. I'll buy your common stock at $15 a share. Is there a problem with that?
Yeah, it creates a tax problem for the common option holders.
So the comment is it creates a tax problem. But why is it a tax problem? If I take common stock, if I take Acorn's money and they pay $15 a share, and then I'm going to turn around that same day and sell a share of common stock to you, and Acorn stock is being invested in as common stock, what price do I have to sell the stock to you at?
Well, you can sell it to me at a lower price, but then the difference is going to be ordinary income.
What's your name?
Bob.
So Bob is saying, if I sell it, in my scenario, if I sell stock to Bob at $15 a share, no problem. But if I sell it to him at less than $15 a share, that creates a huge tax issue for Bob and accounting issues for the company, and that's accurate. So there's another problem, of course, and that is Bob's a sophisticated guy, we assume. Would he buy stock in an early stage company at $15 a share? And you can see immediately the psychology starts to fall apart. Question? Okay. So that's why when I see investors, you see sometimes companies that are formed outside these technology enclaves or biotech enclaves where they're going to do things different. We're going to keep it simple. We're only going to have common stock in our capital structure. And the investors start paying for common stock. What that means is the company is bound effectively to issue common stock to its employees from that point forward at the same price that the investors paid. That's partly why we have a two-class structure. Stock plans. This is real simple stuff, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. First of all, what is it? A stock plan or a stock option plan, they're sometimes referred to in the same, is like a 10 or 15-page document. It's approved by the board and the shareholders. And basically, it lays out the parameters, the administrative parameters by which the company grants stock or grants stock options to its employees and consultants and board members. And typically, those parameters are, the stock has to be sold. This is in writing in the stock plan. The stock has to be sold at fair market value. Only employees and consultants and board members are eligible to participate in the plan. It talks about what happens to unvested stock or unexercised stock options at the time of a merger or sale of the company. It has a term of 10 years. It talks about other things as well. But that's all it does. And it's there as a platform, in part to ensure compliance with the securities laws, and in part because it does provide some housekeeping protocols on how a company should be granting stock to employees and consultants. The most important element of the stock plan, at least the one that gets the most discussion, is the stock reserve. So one of the parameters of the plan is it says, this is a stock plan, and we are going to set aside 1.5 million shares as the reserve of shares under the plan. So I'm going to skip forward here. So there's some vocabulary here. When a company reserves stock under the plan, all it is it's just a bookmark. It requires a board resolution, and the board says, hey, we're approving a plan, and we're approving a reserve of 1.5 million shares under the plan. Those shares are not issued or outstanding. They're not voting. And by the way, you can't say, hey, we're going to do something different. We're going to put a price on those shares today, like 2 cents a share, and those 2-cent shares, we're going to warehouse them as part of this reserve, and then we're always going to issue 2-cent shares going forward as part of the reserve. You can't do that. Shares have to be priced at fair market value on the date of grant. So the stock reserve is not cast in concrete. As you grant stock options and the stock options get exercised, the reserve comes down. And from time to time, the board will go back in and say we need to replenish the reserve, we need more stock in the gas tank that we can provide to our employees, and we'll go back and increase the reserve under the plan. How much of reserve do you do? What's the discipline? The discipline usually is a horizon of about as far as a manager can reasonably see. And there are different schools of thought on that. I think that's about 12 to 18 months. Sometimes it's tagged to what's the next financing, because usually a financing transaction and the new investors coming in, it becomes a pivot point. The new investors have a chance to say, you know, we don't think your reserve is adequate, and we think you need to bump it up before we invest. And so, you know, that the replenishment exercise occurs, I would say, every year to a year and a half, sometimes more frequently if a financing occurs more frequently than that. This is really key. Investors include the reserve in negotiating valuation. So, you know, when you look at the capital structure of a company, you know, you've got founder stock, which is common stock, you've got employees, and you've got the venture investors coming in, they're buying preferred stock. But before they will look at the capital structure of a company, they want to see, you know, they want to understand what's the number of shares set aside for issuance upon exercise of outstanding option grants. And they also want to know, so how many shares do you have in the kitty? How many shares are you anticipating as your head count grows as you look out 12 to 18 months? And in effect, when I'm looking at the capital structure of kind of a normative venture-backed company, you know, if the investors are coming in and say, you know, we want 50% of the company, and that's their negotiating strategy, that 50% is premised on the existing of the reserve. So the founders can't say, well, wait a second, you know, the investors should only be looking at the shares that are issued and outstanding. We'll build in the option reserve after the investors have come on board. That's not how it works. In almost every case, Herb is laughing at me. In almost every case, you know, the investors will insist that the option reserve be established. They will want to see your headcount ramp. They will want to see your bottoms-up analysis to understand how you as a CEO or executive are constructing your equity matrix going forward. And they want to make sure that that reserve is built into the capital structure of the company. Even though it's not issued and outstanding, it's built into the capital structure of the company to ensure that when they put up their money and they want 50% of the stock, it's 50% of a fully diluted basis. It's 50% taking into consideration that the option reserve is already baked into the capital structure. So the board mechanics of pricing. There's no magic to this, but sometimes I forget that a lot of people don't understand how boards do this. So anytime stock is issued, whether it's stock issued to Acorn Capital as an investor or stock issued to Bob as the CEO of a company, the board has to get together and make a decision. How many shares and what's the price? And that decision can be reflected either in an actual meeting of the board or a compensation committee, or in an action by written consent. But every time there's an issuance of stock, there has to be a concurrent board action. So stock price doesn't just magically rise. It rises in accordance with the frequency by which the board meets. And you know, if the company is doing great, stock prices will go up. If the company is not doing so great, stock prices come down. But that decision on how the price is set, it's set by the board. And there has to be a board meeting, and there has to be or an action by written consent. You know, all this scandal that was going on option backdating, this is effectively, I mean, this is, I'm off on a folly here, but it's really important that when you have a board meeting on March 3, you can only grant stock on March 3. You're not having a board meeting on March 3 and looking back in December 15th and saying, you know, the stock price was lower than, why don't we have a board meeting? Why don't we just take the position that we met as a board back on December 15th and we'll reflect all the documents as dated that back to then. That's option backdating. Not a good thing. People wear stripes for that. All right, so, and think of it this way. If you're issuing common stock, think compensation. Common stock to employees or consultants or board members. Think compensation. Think fair market value. Think accounting, and I should say, and tax. And think cheap stock in Section 409A. We'll get into these. This is accounting, and this is tax. On the other hand, if you're issuing stock to investors, you know, that's not an income statement transaction, that's a balance sheet transaction. And fair market value is at arm's length. You're negotiating on that value. I may be able to issue Bob common stock at 23 cents a share, but if John Soberg is a partner at Blumberg Capital and he wants to buy common stock from me at a penny a share or warrants for common stock at a penny a share, if he's an investor, there's no income statement impact. It's all balance sheet, and there's nothing that precludes me from issuing I could issue common stock warrants to John Soberg as an investor at a penny a share and have no influence on my ability to issue stock to Bob as a manager at 23 cents a share. They're apples and oranges. Investors, employees, compensation, investment, okay? Restricted stock versus stock options. I'm not going to spend time on this, but you know, all restricted stock is common stock that's subject to a contractual restriction. That's usually vesting, and we'll talk about that. The good thing about restricted stock is, hey, if I get a stock certificate, it has my name on it. It says, you know, 150,000 shares, and it has a signature of 2 officers in the company. I'm a stockholder. I can vote. My capital gains period begins, so if I sell the stock after I've held it for a year, I get capital gains treatment on it. That's important. But at some point, you know, companies will flip and start granting stock options. Well, stock options, the good news is that if the stock price today is 23 cents a share, I have an option that runs for 10 years, which means that I don't have to put up the money right now. I don't have to pay 23 cents a share. And as long as my option remains, you know, active, I can exercise it at the 23 cent price. However, I'm not a shareholder. I'm an option holder, and I can't vote my shares unless and until I exercise my option. And what that means, probably most as a second consideration, is capital gains doesn't begin to run until I've exercised the option. Okay. So when do you use restricted stock? When do you use stock options? It's really simple for most cases. It depends on how affordable the stock price is. So if I'm offering Bob a chance to buy stock at 15 bucks a share, and there are companies in the Valley today that are doing this because they're worth it, Bob is saying, forget that. I don't have any 15 bucks a share. And by the way, since I'm a valued employee, it is your obligation to make sure that I'm compensated with equity. So you go to stock options. You know, you offer Bob the opportunity for a stock option, 10 years, and as long as the stock price, you know, if it goes up, then Bob, over the course of 10 years, can make an investment decision whether to pay the exercise price. So when does it typically happen? I don't know. I would say most companies, when they're just formed, will issue restricted stock to their early stage employees. It's cheap. It's a tenth of a penny a share, or it's a penny, or 2 cents, or 3 cents. People can afford that, and it's writing a check for, you know, $116. It's not a big deal, and they get the benefit of voting, and they get their capital gains period running. But at some point where you're looking at your equity matrix and selling stock to Roger for 75,000 shares, and it's 10 cents a share, you know, Roger's going to have to write a check for 750 bucks. So, is that right? Yeah, 7,500 bucks, thanks. That's too much. So at that point, I'm probably going to flip over to stock options. It's all psychology, mentality. When can employees not afford to buy restricted stock? At that point, you just flip over to stock options. Vesting is pretty straightforward. The convention in Silicon Valley and frankly all over the United States in technology enclaves and biotech, it's 4 years. Some venture firms that are, I would say, top tier believe that 5 years is the appropriate convention because it's a privilege to work for the company that they invest in. But 4 years is the convention. Usually it's cliff vesting, which means it's kind of a probationary period for the first year, and then typically it's month-to-month vesting thereafter. Vesting in effect means, for those of you that don't know, if I'm issuing Bob stock at 2 cents a share, and he's under a 4-year vesting arrangement, at the end of 3 years he quits. His shares that are not vested, even though the shares at the time may be worth $5 a share, I can continue to buy back from him. Contractually, I have the right to buy back from him at 2 cents a share. So that's vesting, and the effect of it is to put handcuffs on people. They don't want to leave the company until they're vested with their shares. Yes?
Question on the previous slide. You talked about restricted stock. That's different than RSUs, right? I guess
Yes. Restricted stock units we're not going to talk about. Those are typically public company vehicles. Okay. So, this scenario of 4-year vesting, that's called time-based. It's real simple. You're either employed or you're not. If you're employed, you continue to vest. On the date that you're no longer an employee in the company, then your time-based structure stops and the unvested shares are repurchasable by the company. By the way, just one other thought here. Vesting pertains, for restricted stock, it's simple. It's a contract that says if it's unvested, the company gets to buy the stock back. If it's a stock option, it's still 4-year vesting. But there, contractually, it works a little bit differently. The stock option agreement says your option becomes exercisable. You have the right to exercise the option in accordance with a 4-year vesting schedule. So it's different because as an employee, you haven't paid anything, but your right to pay, your right to exercise the option and to pay the exercise price is contractually determined, and that also is set to the 4-year vesting scheme. Okay? So time-based is the norm. I would say in most circumstances it's a no-fault arrangement. Employees leave companies for different reasons. They resign, they're fired for cause, they're involuntarily terminated, they step in front of a bus and they die, or they step in front of a bus and they're disabled. As a general premise, professional investors don't want to engage in that dialogue. All they want to know is, are you employed or not? If you're not employed, your vesting time clock stops and the unvested shares are repurchasable by the company. Not all cases, though. Sometimes founders will come in and say, look, goddammit, I'm special. I'm a founder. I spent 3 years in a garage working to get this technology to the point where it's a viable company, and you're telling me that you can fire me and all my unvested shares get repurchased by the company? So it becomes a negotiating point sometimes between founders and investors about whether founders can negotiate a special deal for themselves. Investors, as a general premise, are not highly receptive to that, but it depends on leverage, depends on how anxious they are to get into the company and how much you bring to the table as a founder and CEO. Yes?
Is there ever a scenario where the company may not purchase the stock or a departing employee?
The question is whether a company cannot, is there a circumstance where a company is not able to buy the stock?
Or may not want to, or whatever.
Or may not want to. So obviously if there's no vesting schedule in place, and I issue you stock for 100,000 shares, there's no vesting, that's yours. You step in front of a bus, those shares go to your estate. That's one circumstance. Another circumstance is you've been around at the company long enough, your shares are fully vested, now you step in front of a bus, they still go to your estate. And the third circumstance is where you have investors who come on board, I would say usually unsophisticated investors, and just forget to put vesting in place, or they don't think it's important. And in the environment that we all live in, that's not going to happen. Okay. Oh, the one point I do want to make is that there are other kinds of vesting. I would call it, there's time-based and performance-based. And because the accounting regs have changed in the last 5 years, we're starting to see some examples of performance-based vesting. For example, I'm going to pick on Rakesh. So if I grant him an option for 100,000 shares, we may say 50,000 of those shares will vest or become exercisable upon the occurrence of an IPO. That's performance-based. It may be an external factor. It may be something that's tied to Rakesh's performance as an individual. If he's the CEO, then he's got to get to first commercial release of a product, something like that. Let me just check to see what time it is. How much time do I have? Okay. So,
If you let's say you leave after 3 years and you have your options are vested, but don't you often have to then exercise them and pay the exercise price?
so Bob is raising the question, what happens if I'm an option holder and I leave as an employee? It's a good point. There is a form of option, it's called an incentive stock option, which we're going to talk about right now, that has to be exercised within 90 days after the date of termination. So in effect, it puts the employee in the position of having to fish or cut bait. They have to exercise that option within 90 days to the extent it's exercisable or vested on the date of termination. And if they fail to do that, the option expires. So that frequently becomes kind of a financial pinch point for an employee who's trying to figure out, God, do I have the money to exercise it? And is it worthwhile in the context of the company that I'm leaving?
Most non-qualified options are structured that way as well.
Yes, it's a good point. The comment is, are non-statutory options structured the same way? Frequently they are, because the company needs closure on whether options are alive and outstanding or expired in the context of a terminating employee. They don't have to be, but they are. Probably the most important thing to take away from this is that most venture-backed companies use incentive stock options. There are two flavors, but they use ISOs, or incentive stock options, as the flavor of options that they grant to employees. ISOs can only be granted to employees, and they purportedly have this tax benefit that if you hold them for at least 2 years from the date of grant and 1 year from the date of exercise, you'll get capital gains. In most instances, that's not the case. Usually employees hang on to their ISOs upon the occurrence of a sale event or an IPO. They'll exercise their option and flip it into the public market, or they'll exercise their option to participate in the consideration being offered in the merger. If they do that, they don't satisfy the holding period requirements, and it therefore downgrades into a non-statutory status. That's the other flavor. So to give you just a pictorial, the purported benefit of an ISO is no tax on grant, no tax on exercise. When the stock is sold, assuming you meet the holding period requirements, you get capital gains for all of it. For ENSOs, the non-statutory option, which is everything else, no tax on grant, but tax on exercise. And the difference between the exercise price and the value of the stock at that point is ordinary income. And then everything forward from here is capital gains, assuming, again, that you meet the holding period requirements. One key point, and hold this in mind, ISOs have to be priced at fair market value. If they're not priced at fair market value, then by definition they default to this thing called the non-statutory option. So hold that thought. Non-employees, who gets stock and how much? How many investors are here in the room? I need to know who's in the, okay, so you guys, I'm just going to be direct. So as a general premise, institutional investors, and to my thinking, I believe this also includes angel investors that function as groups, don't get stock. They're on the board. If they're sitting on the board, they're there to monitor their investment and to support management and to help the company grow. But I have seen I've never seen an institutional investor, I've seen some angel investors say, not only do you have my investment money, but I also want some stock options since you've got me gracing your board of directors. I think that's inappropriate, but it's a style thing, and it comes down to, a negotiation between the founders and the investors. So you need to think about that. Outside directors, companies, cash is more important than your mother. So you don't use cash to compensate your board members, your outside board members. You use stock. How much? It's all over the lot. It depends on the luminary value of the board member, the contribution they're expected to make, what other outside board members are getting. I've seen as high as 3%, and this is for an institutionally financed company, and as low as like 0.25%. So again, it becomes a point of negotiation. Same thing for advisory board members. Advisory boards, many companies have them. Some are used quite frequently, and there's a very active engagement between the company and the advisory board member. Other cases, it's more like window dressing, and they're never used. That can be a driver in terms of how many shares you decide to provide your advisory board members. It's all over the lot. If you were going to start somewhere, I would say maybe 0.25% of the fully diluted capital, but it ought to have 5 figures to it. It ought to feel like 10,000 or 15,000. It ought to feel hefty enough so that you're doing right by your advisory board members. The one takeaway from this is keep it simple. People will find out. Outside board members will know what their counterparts are getting. Your advisory board members. If you have these weird-ass arrangements and you're doing one thing for one board member or something else for the other, but you're otherwise treating them equally or demanding equal time or commitment from them, you need to rationalize this as a manager. And that's why I would encourage you to think, set a structure and then see if you can make people come in and buy into that structure. Everyone else has their handout. Stock is what makes the world go round. So if you're talking to executive search firms, you're talking to venture funders or commercial banks, in most cases, and especially during economic upswings where there's a sense that, God, the world is going great, everyone's got their hand out. They want some stock, and it's negotiated. If the auditors want stock, you better fire them, because there's some strict literature. Auditors have to be independent, and they will never ask for stock. They're probably the easiest game in town from that perspective. All right, so I want to talk about FAS 123R. I'm going to go real fast here. So I want to talk about your income statement. So the premise here is, an income statement is revenue, it's cost of goods, and that leads you to a gross profit. And then you have operating expenses, right? So you've got general and administrative costs, you've got sales and marketing, and you've got R&D. And that gives you, net income. So that's your income statement. Now, FAS 123R, Financial Accounting Standard 123R, was adopted, I think, in 2006. And there's a huge amount of heat and light in Silicon Valley. The premise of FAS 123R is, hey, stock is a form of compensation. And you, therefore, have to value that stock and record it as a compensation expense on your income statement. This is a change, is a huge sea change. Before FAS 123R, there was this thing called APB 25, which basically said, hey, if you grant stock to your employees, and the only restriction is time-based vesting, and it's priced at fair market value, and the number of shares is fixed, you can ignore it as a compensation expense. So John Doerr of Kleiner Perkins led the crusade against the Financial Accounting Standards Board and said, you guys are nuts. You're going to kill the goose that's laying the golden egg. If you adopt FAS 123R, I predict the collapse of the technology sector. And there was a lot of angst that went on about that. The board went forward. They did adopt FAS 123R, and in fact, we're okay. The world has continued. But the effect of it is that if I'm granting Bob an option for 100,000 shares, and through whatever method of valuation I choose, the Black-Scholes method, the lattice method, or whatever, I think that option grant today is worth, $10,000, and it vests over the course of 4 years. and Bob happens to be the CFO of the company, then I need to take this $10,000 expense and include it as a non-cash expense on my income statement. So in effect, my operating expenses as a result of FAS 123R are going up, which means my net income is going down. That's the impact of FAS 123R. And it means that every option grant to consultants, option grant and restricted stock grant, whether to a consultant or an employee, has to be valued and then expensed as a compensation expense on the income statement. So hold that for a moment. So in effect, before the advent of FAS 123R and before the SEC went nuts over this, this is kind of a common structure that companies used in pricing their stock options. You sell preferred stock at $1 a share, you apply your 90% discount rule, and it means from this point forward until your next round of financing, you're pricing your common stock at 10 cents a share. $3 share for your Series B round, 90% rule, 30-cent price. $5 for Series C, 90% rule, 50 cents. And then miraculously, our next round, hey, we're going to do an IPO. We're going to sell our stock at $10 a share, and you'd find this miraculous hockey puck curve that would take the common stock price right up to the price of the public stock on the date of the IPO. And the SEC looked at that and said, you know, that is BS. We think you guys are gaming the system here, and we are going to hold you accountable because now we have FAS 123R, which, number one, requires you to record stock as a compensation expense. And secondly, if you record it less than what it should have been valued, we have the right as the SEC to come in and second guess your valuation. And therefore, we're going to take the position if we think we can't justify the difference between the red line and the blue line based on the differences between the common stock and the preferred stock, we're going to hit your income statement with a huge amount of compensation expense. So effectively, the SEC and the auditors started drilling down, and on the date of the IPO, you know, the company's trying to go out on the roadshow, trying to sell stock, and they've been very aggressive in pricing their common stock to employees. The SEC said all that gets reflected as an operating expense, non-cash, GAAP-compliant operating expense on your income statement. And the effect is, you know, that net income that you're talking about as the cornerstone of your roadshow for a public offering, that's now a red number. You're now running at a loss. So that was a source of embarrassment for companies that were trying to get out and go public. As a result of that, I mean, there's been a little more deference to the power of the SEC and the auditors. Companies are much less aggressive in terms of how they price their common stock in future rounds of the company as they go forward. These are just, again, these are just notional as opposed to specific. So under FAS 123R, you have to, you know, the fair value of the stock options is determined on the date of grant. It's expensed, and they're no different than cash compensation. Has any of this made a difference in the way companies incentivize their employees? None. None. I mean, they still use time-based stock options. There's a little bit of there's no penalty for using performance-based options under FAS 123R. They both get expensed. You don't find as many companies using performance-based, but they're both available. But the answer is none. And partly the reason for that, we have a disagreement here.
I would argue that the difference that it has caused is a general increase in the exercise price of the options that are granted.
The comment is that, in fact, FAS 123R has resulted in a change, and that is options are more expensive. I think I agree with that. I think the fact is you do have your independent auditors looking steely-eyed at you as you're pricing your stock options, and that certainly is a factor for purposes of how boards look about option pricing.
Also, people doing 409As are making more money nowadays.
So we're going to talk about Section 409A. So FAS 123R is accounting. It has nothing to do with the optionee. If I sell stock to Bob at 23 cents a share, and the board says, in my good faith, I think that's the right number, and the auditors come back a year later and say, you know that 23 share stock we sold to Bob, it really should have been priced at $1.50. There's no implication to Bob. There's no tax issue. It's accounting, and it hits the income statement of the company. But no one comes back to Bob and says, you know, geez, too bad, because now you have to face, you know, an audit by the IRS. There's nothing like that. But now we have a new sheriff in town. It's Section 409A. Yes?
The only issue for Bob is if the IRS at a later date comes back and disqualifies your plan, because they say, hindsight, you granted the stock to no fair market value.
So the comment is there is a risk, and that is on audit either of the company or audit of perhaps Bob. There's the potential that the service could step in and say, you guys were issuing stock to Bob at below its fair market value, and therefore he should be taxed. Under FAS 123R, that's never happened. But let me, your point is a fair one, so let me talk about Section 409A, because this really brings the point home. So Section 409A, you know, came out, effectively it was legislated and became final in 2007. And effectively 409A says that deferred compensation is subject to its own special taxation regime. So here's how it works. First of all, it doesn't pertain to incentive stock options, and it doesn't pertain to restricted stock. Just, I mean, it covers a lot of stuff, but for purposes of our discussion, it's relevant only for purposes of non-statutory stock options. So if I grant to Bob, I'm going to continue to pick on you, you don't mind. We'll get there, we'll get there. If I give Bob a non-statutory stock option that has an exercise price less than fair market value, here's the problem. So Bob gets an option for 23 cents, 100,000 shares vesting over 4 years, say in annual increments. Bob does nothing with it. He says thank you to the board. You know, I'm a loyal, dutiful employee. I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to get this option from the board. And the board, in its good judgment, has determined the option price is 23 cents a share. And Bob takes the option agreement and stuffs it in a drawer and forgets about it. The first year, 25,000 shares vest, and the price of the common stock has now gone from 23 cents a share to $1.23 a share. On that date, and again, Bob has done nothing, 409A kicks in and says non-statutory option, priced, it should have been priced at, instead of 23 cents a share, it should have been priced at 25 cents a share. And on the date of vesting for that first 25,000 shares, you know, it's at $1.23. That is taxable immediately to Bob now on the date of vesting. And it's not just taxable now as ordinary income, regardless of whether it's ISO or ENSO. There's a 20% tax surcharge penalty for federal purposes. And by the way, if Bob is residing in California, there's a 20% tax surcharge as well. So Bob, what do you think about this deal? So, you know, this is just the first year of vesting. In each successive year, even though you've done nothing, the IRS is just, you know, just collecting money. You know, not collecting money, they're just kind of waiting like a snake in the grass to come out and get you as soon as they figure out what's going on. So as a dutiful employee of the company, and now you're audited, and the IRS says, geez, Bob, too bad, you owe a huge amount of money to us in form of income and tax and penalties. What's your reaction?
I want my company to pay my taxes.
So Bob is looking unhappy, and he comes back to the board and says, I've been screwed in a major way, and I'm looking to you guys to do right by me. So boards are afraid of this. The IRS has incentive now. There's a financial incentive for the service to go after this. And boards understand that, you know, they don't want to face the ire of people like Bob who have done nothing other than to be good employees. As a result, everyone is trying to understand how to comply with Section 409A. Here's the trap, by the way. So the IRS comes in, and let's say we give Bob an ISO at 23 cents a share, and the IRS comes in with the benefit of second sight and says, that option should have been priced at 25 cents a share. So we know ISOs technically are not subject to 409A, but it wasn't priced at fair market value. So the trap is that on audit, the service says it wasn't priced at fair market value, therefore it defaults to non-statutory option, and therefore it falls squarely within Section 409A. So that's the problem. And there's some parameters on how much heat and light you have to go to establish the fair market value. But at the end of the day, the practices that are followed by the boards are more or less as follows. And again, I hesitate to put this in writing, but it's kind of a normative standard. For companies that are not funded yet or have angel funding, as a general premise, they're not going to go out and get an outside appraisal. They just don't. There's not what's the thinking on that? I think the thinking is these are companies at a very incipient stage. There is a preferred stock outstanding. It's got a liquidation preference. If the company goes south, that liquidation preference sucks out all the value of the company. So it's okay to price common stock. Dead reckoning, 90% discount, we think that's a fair standard to use. Mid-stage companies, what I've seen is that as companies bring on institutional investors, the institutional investors really don't understand the technical sides of Section 409A, but they really get the notion that if Bob is pissed off because he's audited, that they're looking down his gun barrel. And so as a result, their inclination is to go ahead and at least once a year, sometimes twice a year for these kind of early stage institutionally financed companies to go out and get an outside appraisal that meets the requirements of Section 409A so they can have, they can stick in their pocket, something that they can rely on as justifying how they price the 23-cent option. For mezzanine or later stage companies, boy, they get religion in a major way. They're all about getting appraisals twice a year, sometimes 4 times a year. In some cases where the board's meeting frequently, they'll have an appraisal every time they grant an option. For companies that are within striking distance of an IPO, or if they're thinking about selling the company and putting themselves in the shoes of the buyer has to look at this as well. Section 409A is a potential liability for them as well. So the practice tips on this is, the CFO is the driver between valuation for options and stock. Projections are always based on assumptions. Don't play games. Use the same assumptions for both your auditors and your outside appraiser. Secondly, make sure the appraisers and the auditors are communicating. It's unfortunate to have an auditor come up with one price and an outside appraiser come up with a different one. It causes confusion. The auditors don't relent. They will use their price. They kind of don't care what the outside appraiser wants. And it's nice if you can orchestrate a convergence of the analysis so it ends up in the same place. There's one thing that I saw recently, which is, FAS 123R says that when you're valuing options or stock, you should use fair value. Section 409A says, when you're valuing options or stock, you should use fair market value. And there's lots of literature on how you crank the formulas for the valuation. So in one case, we had a company that was pricing under FAS 123R, their stock price was $8.75. And the appraiser came in under 409A and was $2.75. Huge difference. And the company said, hey, we got a choice. We're gonna price our options at $2.75. And we thought that was ill-advised. And I think when the board was presented with the 2 data points, they agreed. They said, look, we don't want to be a poster child for the IRS and have the IRS come back to us and say, you guys knew there was one valuation at 409A and another one under 123R, and you picked the lower of the 2. We don't think that's acting in good faith. So the board effectively sent the appraiser back out to recrank the analysis, and they came up with a number that was much closer to the analysis under 123R.
But not the other way around.
Not the, well, I mean, again, the auditors they're independent and they also have potential liability. So they're not likely to be negotiated off their position. So, and the other tip is just, as companies grow and move forward, it's important to, evaluate how frequently you should get these outside appraisals.
Have you seen, you mentioned the gaps been closing on the exercise price as the company matures? What's happening? It used to just be 90/90, So is it, how far is it?
Before a public offering, you mean?
Well, like,
Yeah, that's right. I mean, what they're trying to do is they're saying, okay, starting a year before the IPO, we want you to straight line your valuation to reach the IPO target price that you now think that you now know or think you're going to get. And the problem with the logic is that the SEC only sees those companies that actually do go public or at least file. And so they have a selective view of the marketplace, and I think that's the reverse trap, which is allowing your option exercise prices to get, in some sense, artificially elevated by this whole process. And you end up in situations where you've got people who, their options are underwater. And it's just a result of this artifact.
So the discussion revolves around, industry trends on pricing. The tension is a clear one. And CEOs, I really respect this. I mean, they're looking steely-eyed and saying, look, I've got a company to run. I've got employees to hire and people to retain. And I can't do that with an option at $8.75. I can do it with an option at $2.75. And so they're fully prepared to game the system to some extent, where if in fact the 409A appraiser can be, encouraged to come up with a lower price, they clearly understand, the appraiser clearly understands that, and they're being compensated by the company. And yet the board is very fearful of the repercussions if you don't get 409A right. They themselves are looking down the gun barrel of a lawsuit from employees or audit from the auditors. So it's a problem. I'm going to wrap up here. I do have handouts, so I can hand these out and you can walk away with the slides. And we'll spend the next 15 minutes taking questions. And what I'd like to do, just so I know that people have jobs to get to, is we'll go ahead and pass these out now, and then if people have questions, we can talk. But if you need to go, feel free to leave now. Can I ask you to pass those around? Here's some here. Just take one and pass it around. Okay, questions? Anything? Yes, Rakesh.
I was told that FAS 123R has been replaced by another ruling now more recently. Is that not true?
So FAS 123R isn't called FAS 123R. It has a different, I think it was amended with a different name, but I don't.
ASC 718.
Thank you. But I think it fundamentally works the same way as the way I've described it.
So there's no change in the way it works.
Right. Yeah, Jennifer?
When you set up your option pool, do you have to designate which ones are going to be ISO options?
So the question is, when you set up your option plan and you're granting options to employees, do you have to designate whether they're an ISO or an NSO? The answer is yes. In the contract, it has to say this is an incentive stock option. And then it also has to have all the rules and requirements that meet the statute for incentive stock options, and it has to be priced at fair market value.
But that's in the contract with the employee. I'm talking when you set up the pool to begin with.
Yeah, so the
Do you
stock
have to
plan.
guess as to how many are going to be ISO?
No, you don't have to guess in advance. You have a stock reserve for 1.5 million shares, and the plan says, under the plan, you can grant ISOs, you can grant NSOs, you can grant restricted stock, and you don't have to make that decision until you actually write the paperwork up. Yeah. Yes, Alex.
Who is your outside appraiser to set the fair market price, and what kind of data do they use to make that assessment?
So the question is, who's the outside appraiser for Section 409A, and what kind of data do they use? There's a whole cottage industry that's come up, and there are a lot of boutique firms around, especially around here, and their prices range anywhere from probably $5,000 to $7,000. All the way up to the institutional appraisers that'll charge you $75,000. So absolutely, there's a cottage industry. Every lawyer has a Rolodex of appraisers and knows pretty much kind of how much they're priced at and how to who are the more more reliable ones. Once you get into it, you'll find there's a lot of information available. The assumptions are the data they use. I mean, they use classic financial methodologies, comparable companies, discounting to, the venture capital method, which we've talked about. They've used all the terminal values and so forth. They also, but their information, that's the easy part. You're just cranking data into a formula. They really rely heavily on the assumptions that the company provides to them. And so if the company is saying, God, it's gloom and doom and we're never going to get anywhere and lots of challenges and issues, sure, the appraisal is going to come back and say, this is a very low price. And CFOs play that game. The problem is that if they provide the same assumptions to their auditors, the auditors require the CFO to sign away, his or her life, attesting to the integrity and fairness of the assumptions. It also looks strange after the fact if nothing fundamentally has changed in your business and your stock price suddenly skyrockets. So, Bob.
Have there been any cases yet? Because it's been around for like 4 years now.
Section 409A.
Yeah, that have had any of these valuations for a trial?
Yeah, the question is whether there have been any audits or claims by the IRS under Section 409A. I'm not aware of any. I know there are, all these big companies that are now looking at IPOs. We've got LinkedIn, I think, that filed. Facebook is under the gun. They've surpassed 500 shareholders. So there are a lot of these big companies, and I think if the IRS is going to move on this, I would pick one of those companies and as I say, establish a poster child for it. Herb, do you know if there are any 409A cases?
Well, I agree with you completely, that we may see it right now because of these high profile.
Yeah, Herb's agreeing. The comment is that with all these major companies that are attracting so much attention at such high valuations, looking at the prospect of a public offering this year, I think the IRS, if they're going to make their case, boy, they've got some great ammunition to do it with.
Especially if the company is required to take a charge under 123R.
Yeah, there's an interesting question whether there in fact is a nexus between the accounting analysis that drives to one price and the Section 409A analysis that drives to a different. I mean, if the auditors come back in and say, hey, there's a cheap stock issue here, you may have priced it correctly, but we think for accounting purposes it was underpriced. The service isn't stupid. I mean, to me, that's a logical argument. I don't think that's been made before. Yes?
There's a timing issue as well.
There's what?
There's a timing issue.
There's a timing issue.
You get your 490 valuation when you're granting the stock, and then, the auditors come in after the fact, and then they do their evaluation, and they say, oh, you should take a cheap stock charge. So to the extent you relied on an independent appraiser, under 409A, you have the presumption that the valuation you used is reasonable. And, as long as your gap is not too large, I think you have, a defensible position to take to the IRS to say that your options were granted at fair market value.
Yeah, the comment is, I agree. The comment is, the auditors come in once a year. They do quarterly reviews, but on audit, they do come in once a year. And that's where they will really establish what they believe the value of the stock is under FAS 123R. The 409A valuation can occur frequently, much more frequently than once a year. And so the board, in effect, if they have what they think is a reliable report from an outside appraiser under 409A, they will be acting in good faith and they will be observing the safe harbor under 409A, and they can assert that, in fact, that price was a fair price. But the auditors, nevertheless, can still come in just as a matter of a timing difference and assert a different price to the stock. And that's, I think, if the IRS is going to make hay out of this, I think they're going to play up the difference between the accounting analysis and the tax analysis. So why don't we do this? Because I know, why don't we let people go? If you have questions, I'm going to stick around for a while. Herb Faulkner's in the back. He'll stick around for a while. And I know people are anxious to get to work, but it's a pleasure to see you guys. I'm glad to see this many people showed up. Thank you for coming.